right, well, welcome everyone, Friday, 12 noon to the migration workshop. There's lots of seats around the table, so feel free to join us or add seats to the table. And welcome to our online participants as well. I'm Catherine Donato. I am a professor here in the School of Foreign Service, part of the study of international migration. And I get the pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Michael Clemens. Michael is a professor of economics at George Mason University for quite a number of years before he started at George Mason in 2023.
Last year.
He was at the Center for Global Development. And way before that, he got his PhD at Harvard in economics. Michael, I would say, even though we have several other economists in the room right now, I would say Michael is really the economist of immigration in the US. His knowledge of the US system is very deep. He has published on many other countries and issues about migration globally, but he has deep knowledge, especially of this last administration and how things really work on the inside. So I'm really thrilled and thanks Michael for agreeing to be here today. And he will give his talk and you will see it'll be a lot about the border. And then we will open up, well, you will manage the Q&A however you want. But thank you all for being here and thank you, Mike, for agreeing to come.
Thank you so much. Okay, can you hear me in back if I talk like this? And online, I hope people can hear me. Thank you so much, Catherine, and the other organizers for having me here, and all of you for coming in person, all of you for being online. I'm an economist. What I have to offer today is an economic perspective. It's a very odd time to be coming and talking about GDP, given the different disciplinary perspectives in the room. People are having their work, their jobs, some people, their families affected by recent events. My talking about economic aspects is just because that's what I study. That's what I bring to the table. I don't suggest that those are the most important perspectives at all. I think collectively we learn a lot more from sociology, political science, law, psychology, and others on this issue. I just want to talk about economic evidence because that's what I've contributed to. That's what I know about. And so here we are at this historic moment. We are meeting in this room and online at a time of unprecedented crisis in U.S. policy toward immigration in general and toward the southwest border specifically. And I think it's in the aftermath of this election, it might be a moment to step back from candidates and step back from the party and ask bigger questions about, well, large changes in policy are coming for sure. What should policy be? What would good policy look like? What should we be for? And can economic evidence contribute something to that determination? Not at all being dispositive, but contributing something. I argue that it can. Here is one way to visualize the crisis in U.S. policy towards immigration, specifically at the border. This is month by month over the last 11 years, the number of people who arrived at and crossed the southwest border were encountered by U.S. officials and determined to be inadmissible. That is, no U.S. passport, no visa, no prior permission to enter. That hit an all-time high last December at 10,000 per day, and has come down since then. This is through September, but you can see it's still at, didn't mean to touch the screen. It's still at levels that are high relative to past decades. And something else that is historically unusual is the disposition of these migrants. I've included here in green, dark green is the number who were released directly by Customs and Border Protection into the United States, most with humanitarian parole, conditional parole. The light green is the people who were initially detained by ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The large majority of those were later released into the US. So roughly releases could be thought of as green here. The orange is returns and removals. The red is expulsions under Title 42. So you're looking at over the last few years, the number of people just released when they arrive inadmissible at the border has been something like half to in recent years and months, the vast majority of people just entering. And this, in my personal view, is would fit any reasonable definition of regulatory chaos. This is a chaotic situation. A lot of crossing and releases on terms that were not set out in advance and have been hastily constructed under great pressure in the moment to manage a difficult situation. This chaos, pretty obviously, has been influential in the election. Certainly not the biggest factor, but when 44% of Americans in YouGov polling, of American voters in YouGov polling, say what are the top 3 issues facing the country today, 44% include immigration on that list, and 77% of voters for Trump include immigration on that list. And from other polling, we know that a lot of what they have in mind is the border and irregular arrivals and irregular migrants present. So if you listen to pollsters and many pundits, journalists, knowledgeable journalists, even some academics, they'll tell you that this is a migrant crisis. Just a kind of a way of saying that the responsibility for this crisis, the root cause of this crisis, lies in the decisions of people like the Arevalo family, left Venezuela, arrived in the United States, crossed the border 4th of July of last year, now residing in Long Island City as neighbors of my extended family there. And what I want to argue with a selective and opinionated review of economic research here is that the root cause of this crisis is not the decisions of these people, it is the decisions of these people. That a necessary and sufficient condition for this regulatory crisis is the collective refusal, if you're a US citizen like me, our collective refusal to invest in and build regular channels for migration. So if we were to go to the 30,000 foot level and just look at this policy crisis and ask, well, what are the options going forward? Set aside what's clearly going to come in the short term and medium term. What should we be for? What are the options? With nuance, with some nuances, I will simplify and claim that most of the policy programs we could conceive of fall into one of 3 categories. And the first category is popular in a bipartisan way across the US. It's popular among my neighbors in Virginia. It's popular among my students. It's popular among voters, and that is enforce the law. We're a nation of laws. That only means something if we enforce them. Just enforce the law. Close the ports of entry to inadmissible migrants. For people who cross between ports of entry, violating federal law, detain them until an asylum determination is made, at which point deport the roughly 98% of them that won't get asylum. For people from countries whose ruling regimes will not receive deportees, detain them indefinitely. Call up brigades or entire divisions of military troops in the National Guard, and it's been occasionally mentioned, possibly active military, to do massive sweeps of public places and private establishments across the US to round up into large internment camps, quote, millions, unquote, of immigrants per year, which has been explicitly pledged to start next year. Extend the Bollard pedestrian fence from its current 350 miles to 2,000 miles. Build the wall. If 30 feet isn't enough, make it 40 feet. Make it 60 feet. But above all, in all of these policy priorities, enforce the law. Take the current legal framework that is the fundamental current basis for our immigration policies, which was written by my great-grandparents' generation and has not been substantially revised in 34 years, and just enforce it. Why? Because the people who wrote it understand what we need as Americans. They knew what was going to come. They knew about the 1982 Latin American financial crisis. They predicted the 1994 peso crisis. They understood that they were writing for the ages because they knew that first 9/11 and then the Great Recession would contribute to scuttling the last two major attempts at reforming these laws. They knew we'd still be living with them. They predicted the collapse of Venezuela. They predicted the continuing difficulties of Haiti. They somehow knew that the then young Castro regime would still be in charge in Cuba. And most of all, they and their analytic colleagues modeled and predicted demographic change in Northern Central America, and specifically the labor market needs of the United States by industry, by education level, by state and by county in 2024. And given that they had our interests in mind, all that's left is to enforce what they have to say. Now, it is common among interlocutors of mine to say, well, all this is not really feasible. We have institutions, things are going to stand in the way. I think that is a legitimate point of view. I do want to point out that this incoming administration has an extensive track record. They wanted to make it impossible for most people arriving at the border to seek asylum for years. And then when COVID hit, they found a way to do that in a clause from a 1944 public health law, which eliminated for most people arriving at the border the possibility to seek asylum. Very difficult administrative goal made feasible by creative interpretation of existing statutes, existing rules. Stephen Miller stated in private conversations reported in multiple books that he sought to have 0 refugees arriving in the United States. He did succeed in eliminating 74% of refugee arrivals in the United States before COVID, and then it went down even further. The previous administration set a goal of Muslim exclusion from the United States. And everybody at that time, I was there, said they can't do that. It's going to violate law. There'll be things to stand in the way. It was highly successful. The fraction of Muslims in refugees entering the United States went from 50 to 1%, caused by the travel bans. So this is an administration that knows how to find legal ways to implement their goals. And I don't think that we should take lightly these very explicit statements about what they're planning. But I just want to set those aside and say there could be legitimate concerns about the magnitude of what's actually going to happen. And just say, as an economist, can we say something about what will happen if it does work, if it is successful? And here there are, of course, there are all kinds of effects in all kinds of dimensions that all kinds of disciplines can and should study. But there are explicit economic claims made by the incoming administration. Stephen Miller says that mass deportation will be a labor market disruption celebrated by American workers, who will now be offered higher wages with better benefits to fill these jobs. I want to be clear, as an economist who's actively engaged at the frontier of research, this is a totally fabricated statement. This should be greeted by people reading it in the New York Times with the same attitude that one would read the notions of a person who has established a stance against all vaccines by refusing to read any sort of scientific research about vaccines. There is a substantial literature about exactly this question that finds the opposite. And I just want to highlight one particular highly rigorous study by Chloe East and her co-authors, the University of Colorado. It came out last year in the Journal of Labor Economics, which is the leading peer-reviewed journal for the whole field of labor economics. You really have to give a firstborn to get a paper into this journal. So this is a very, very highly vetted finding. They study mass deportations under the Obama administration, a program that began under Bush 43, but it was mostly executed under Obama. Secure Communities. Secure Communities was a series of collaborations between local law enforcement and federal immigration officials that resulted in the nationwide deportation of, they estimated, roughly 500,000 people. So certainly a very large scale, not quite on the scale of what is being planned. to start next year, but certainly very large scale. And the fact that it was county level agreements and those were not all made at the same time allows them to pursue a strategy for separating correlation and causation, comparing what happened to the labor market in county by county in places where mass deportation had arrived, comparing them to counties, similar counties, often neighboring counties where it had not yet arrived. So they can ask questions like what happened to the job prospects of Americans in affected counties. And a motivating question for research like this is, well, how many jobs for Americans were opened up by mass deportation? And the answer is a negative number. Their bottom line result is that for every 100 workers deported, the number of US jobs in that county went down by 8.8. That is roughly for every 10 deportations, there were one fewer job for Americans. And I don't mean that one American lost their job so that 2 weeks later they could turn around and find another one. I mean, the number of jobs held by Americans went down. And the timescale they study goes out to 4 years. So this is a long-term elimination of employment opportunities for Americans. Why? Half the paper is about why. And the main mechanisms they identify are the deterrence of formation of new businesses, businesses where immigrants and natives work alongside each other, both within establishments and across establishments, and encouragement of the exit of existing businesses. Warwick McKibben, my colleague at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, who's one of the leading international macroeconomic modelers, has made forecasts of the inflation effect of mass deportation in the United States. He does various scenarios, from a low deportation scenario of 1.3 million workers. These are workers, not people, being deported, up to a high scenario of 8.3 million. Reality will probably be somewhere in this range, and he's predicting by 2026 an increase across the entire range of 0.5 percentage points to 3.4 percentage points of additional inflation caused. Why? If you just think of the simplest supply and demand curves in your mind, eliminating immigrant workers from the US economy could reduce demand somewhat. They are consumers. Removing them from the US economy could be a negative demand shock. But the shock to supply is larger, because many of these people are essential workers doing critical steps, tasks that are critical steps in the production of a wide range of goods and services. If supply shifts to the left more than demand shifts to the left, prices go up. Classic supply shock. This is very likely to happen as well. Kind of ironic, since this was one of the leading concerns expressed by voters leading up to the election. Americans can also rely on higher taxes and greater budget deficits for the children to pay for due to mass exclusion. This is the analysis of the nonpartisan technical experts at the Congressional Budget Office. I've met with them twice. These are people who have zero partisan agenda. They are just interested in modeling, using standard models to predict what will happen to the economy. This is the inverse of mass deportation they are modeling here. They are modeling the effect of the recent immigrant surge, they call it. That is the 6 to 7 million additional people remaining in the US due to irregular arrivals over the last 4 years. Finding that it will, over the next 10 years, cumulatively reduce the budget deficit of the United States by $897 billion, getting towards $1 trillion of reduced tax burden to pay for the same government services due to these people participating in the economy. And in this modeling, the effect of mass deportation of exactly the same people would be exactly the reverse of this. That's just how the model would work. So mass deportation of everybody who has arrived with no status or with humanitarian parole or with conditional parole over the last 4 years, which is the goal of the administration. They've successfully marketed it as, well, mass deportation is for people who are unlawfully present. No, they also want to remove the humanitarian parole that 1.3 million people have acquired, with humanitarian parole, which makes them lawfully present in the United States. That's part of the definition of lawful presence, is admitted or paroled. Remove the parole, and then those people become deportable and they get deported. This is a program that is targeting people who are lawfully present and people who are unlawfully present collectively. Something which is certainly not part of the public discourse that I have seen very much. Both of those people are included in these estimates. CBO calls them other foreign nationals, so they're including people with lawful status and people without lawful status.
Sorry, Michael,
Yes,
a clarification about this point. I was wondering also when you showed the graph. Is it right to say that most of the people who arrived in the last few years technically are not undocumented immigrants because they asked for refugee status and they're waiting for their decision?
So this is a legal question, which I really don't have expertise on. I know that if we're talking about humanitarian parole, the Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela program, the CBP1 app program, that amounts to, I think, total 1.3 million people have gotten that. So they are certainly not most of the irregular arrivals. A whole lot of the others have gotten conditional parole, not humanitarian parole, conditional on the outcome of their asylum, on the date of their asylum hearing. And my understanding of the jurisprudence, and lawyers in the room could correct me, is that it is controversial whether conditional parole amounts to lawful presence. There's little or no controversy about whether humanitarian parole gives you lawful presence. My understanding as a consumer of articles and not as an expert is that it is controversial whether the remainder, which is the majority of people who have no status at all or conditional parole, are lawfully present or not lawfully present. So that's my bad ignorant answer. I don't know the answer to that.
No, but that's why, right? That's why they tend, everyone lumps them into the unauthorized. Not that they necessarily should be, but I think that lawyers tend to believe or tend to interpret the statute that way. I don't want to.
A little appreciated aspect of the public discourse is that almost all of the terms that people use are not factually correct.
Yeah.
There's controversy about what's ethical. You know, the Associated Press doesn't use illegal immigrant for I think ethical and moral reasons. A person who has parole, who entered at a port of entry, is lawfully present in the United States, never broke an immigration law, is not unauthorized. They're not illegal. It's not a factually correct statement. So it's just separate from any ethical concerns you might have. The other people, my understanding is that the legal term applied to a lot of them is a person residing under the color of law, or prucol, a 13th century common law doctrine that some judges have believed applies to people with conditional parole. And for example, you can it's written into the Obamacare website if you search it for prucol, that people who are prucol can get Obamacare. So, but nobody has ever heard of the word prucol. And inadmissible is just ridiculous. Nobody's going to say that either. So all of the words that are used in the press and the public discourse are unsatisfactory. Yeah. The closest we have to something accurate is inadmissible or prucol.
Or encounters.
They're encounters.
Yeah.
But different encounters end up with different statuses, some of which just cannot be considered by a reasonable person illegality. But whether prucol is legal is debatable. Okay, so the economic research is really clear on this. There aren't dissenting views about the things that I've showed you. There's no study showing that mass deportation created employment for Americans. That doesn't exist. So this is the confident statements of the incoming administration on this subject are complete ignorant fabrications by people with a political agenda. I just want to make that very clear. If a person is concerned about the economic and other ramifications of this policy, there is a whole other bucket of policy. And I don't say any of the following to be critical of people. I was at USAID for 2 years. I adore the brilliant and talented and energetic people who are working on this agenda. But as I told them lovingly many times, it's a severely problematic. Develop Latin America, to caricature it only slightly, is a political winner as a way to address the border crisis. It's a political winner across the spectrum. It often brings together people from the right and left who might be skeptical of immigration on one side and kind of like poverty reduction on the other side, and they can agree about, well, if we can just develop Latin America, then we'll all get what we want. Worldwide, this has been a political winner. Even in the region, it's been a political winner. Here's the now departed president of Guatemala saying that he's going to work with donors to create un muro de prosperidad, a wall of prosperity, explicitly saying, you know, economic prosperity in Guatemala will be like a wall, and that it will serve the purpose of a wall by preventing migration. And here again, there's a lot of talk about feasibility. You might say, well, what exactly is the policy lever that the United States government can pull to bring economic prosperity to countries run by the Maduro regime or the Ortega regime? What is the policy lever that the United States can pull to bring prosperity to Haiti, where economic historians of the Madison Project believe that real income per capita now in Haiti is not just lower than it was in 1985. It's lower today than it was in 1945. Whatever that lever is, nobody has discovered it yet for outsiders to do that. But I don't even want to talk about the feasibility of this enterprise. I want to talk about evidence of what if it could be done. The evidence that I review in a book chapter, and that comes not just from economics, but from political science, sociology, human geography, anthropology, suggests in fact that economic development, if we're talking about low-income countries, unleashes more migration, complements migration, does not substitute for migration, especially to richer destination countries. And I'll just show you a smattering of that evidence. This is a paper with Maria Pia Mendola of the University of Milan Bicocca, where we use nationally representative survey data from 99 developing countries. This is just Honduras as an example. Individual level data. The horizontal axis here is the distribution of real household income per capita, and that's the orange bell curve. And across that distribution, this blue line is the fraction of people at each income level who answered yes to all three of the following questions in the Gallup World Poll. Ideally, I would like to emigrate to another country. In the next year, I am planning to emigrate to another country, and I am imminently preparing to depart my country by doing costly things like buying passage. That goes way up across the income distribution. It is just not the case that people who are destitute poor are more likely to be leaving. That's for a complex range of reasons. One is the simplest and most direct, which is moving regularly or irregularly is incredibly expensive. People borrow to the hilt all of their friends and family to do this. But much more than that, economic development brings human capital development. Economic development brings more connections overseas. Economic development brings better knowledge of foreign languages. Economic development in a way that other disciplines have much more to say than economists, contributes to the gap between aspirations and achievements, especially for people's children. All of the above complement migration, don't substitute for it. And all of the above are true for any given person making the decision to move or not. But moreover, the number of people making that decision goes up with economic development. Meaning that even if people's decisions at the individual level weren't changed, there would be more migrants just because the number of people going up increases. And I want to just show an example of how that happened in Guatemala. This is 1950 to present. So this is real data in the view of the Economic Commission for Latin America. Everything to the right of this is a forecast out to 2100. The red line here is child mortality, the fraction of children born alive who do not make it to their 5th birthday because they're killed by something that happens in the meanwhile, collapsing in Guatemala. In part due to successful economic development. Guatemala started in 1950 as a low-income country, then it became a lower middle-income country. In 2017, it is now an upper middle-income country. Development, one way or another, is happening in Guatemala. When poor people get a little bit of income, one of the first things they do worldwide is invest in things that make their children not die. And another regularity of the development process that is on display here is fertility changes as well. In green here, this is fertility above replacement. So 0 here has been scaled to 2.1. fertility goes down, but with a lag. Varies across countries, but there's very frequently a lag of 10, 20, 30 years, meaning that there's a 10, 20, 30-year period when children are still being born, but are not dying, fortunately. Meaning that 20 years after that, there is a surge of young people into the labor market. And that's this. This is the absolute change year on year in the net change in the number of young working age people in Guatemala, hitting an all-time high. This is why 30 years ago, sociologist Doug Massey was saying you're going to be seeing a whole lot more migration from Northern and Central America and less relatively from Mexico. One of the most accurate predictions in migration I've ever seen. Not many people listened to him at that time. But if you want to know, well, why have we been seeing so many Central American migrants recently? There are all kinds of causes, but this is a big one. And notice also what's going to happen to that number as the demographic transition peters out in Guatemala. All of this means, just note what this is. This is a consequence of development. It is not a result of poverty. It is a dynamic process that results from the reduction of poverty. Migration pressure is a symptom of emergence from poverty. It is a symptom of successful economic development. Is this correlation or causation? We have a bunch of micro level studies. Here I'm showing a couple by Manuela Angelucci and Kavin Makur and others who have studied randomized cash transfers, where you have a randomized treatment group and control group, some of whom get large cash transfers, some of whom don't. Do people who get the cash transfers invested in things that make their lives better at home and they don't need to migrate, or are they more likely to migrate? In the short term from Mexico, Progresa transfers caused more migration, more labor migration from Mexico. 20 years later, Calvin McClure found them causing more migration from Mexico. Calvin is back in Honduras studying Craft Dos, finding that randomized cash transfers in Honduras caused more migration. By successfully increasing the human capital of children, making them healthier, making them more likely to get educated, that caused them to be more likely to migrate. Because again, expanding the gap between aspirations and achievements. Also in Nicaragua. And we have evidence on this from West Africa and from Comoros in Africa and from Indonesia. This is really very, very strong evidence. Notwithstanding all this evidence, I have sat with extremely savvy, knowledgeable development experts who tell me, okay, Michael, blah, 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 statistics and whatever. I've talked to these people. Have you sat down and talked with them? They'll tell me I left because of poverty. And you're telling me they're lying? No, they're not lying. It's just that if you are talking to migrants, you are not talking to the poorest people. You're not talking to people who are too poor to be able to migrate. There is another option. And depending on how much time I have, I'll talk about another categorically different set of policy proposals, which are to invest in regular channels for migration. Regulatory chaos can be addressed in various ways. The economic literature roughly divides them into punish and prevent and permit. And these are roughly our three options. I don't mean to be super reductionist. There are other options. I don't argue for just one of these. But certainly we have a vast underinvestment in this area relative to its importance. And I mean it relative to its importance, not just in addressing the chaos that is so unpopular among US voters, but in strengthening these others, in synergistically increasing their effects. I just want to say several things from the research literature about lawful channels. Lawful channels, I should specify regular channels. Regular channels for migration are tiny. They're really minuscule. A lot of my work in the government was to try to increase in any possibly administratively feasible way lawful channels and regular channels for migration. I just want to illustrate what I mean by minuscule. I'm going to focus on 7 countries, which are Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, and the 3 Northern Central American countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, just 7 countries that have been important at the border recently. This is for fiscal year 2022, so right in the middle of this surge. How many encounters? 1.2 million people from those 7 nationalities arriving at and crossing the border inadmissible. Very large numbers historically. So then the question is, how many regular channels were there for those people? How many visas could they have gotten? So I'll count up all the visas, setting aside one exception, which is a US citizen spouse. Essentially, none of these people have a US citizen spouse. That's totally irrelevant to them. I'm including everything else. I'm including non-immigrant visas and immigrant visas. I'm including the O1 alien of extraordinary ability visa. I'm including H1B high skill visas, visas that are patently irrelevant to almost all of these people. You can't get past 34,000 visas issued for new arrivals from these countries at this time. So that means 35 encounters per visa. For one visa, 35 people, not just wanting to move, not just attempting to move, not just getting to the border, but successfully crossing the border in inadmissible. Grants of asylum in fiscal 2022 for people from these 7 countries, less than 12,000, which is 98 encounters per grant of asylum. Let's just visualize that. Here's the number of people coming all the way to the border, successfully making it to the border and crossing the border. This is the number of visas that were available to them. This is the number of grants of asylum. That's not a situation where these people have any alternative at all. And humanitarian parole of 1 or 2 years just puts them back into the same situation 1 or 2 years later. There remains no regular channel for them. Regular channels for these people, and this is what we worked on in the government, are mostly low-skilled work visas at this time. Nearly everyone we talk to doesn't like low-skilled work visas. You say the word H2 in the Department of Labor, you get a lot of allergies in your immediate response. I don't like our H2 visa. Tying workers to employers is a recipe for violations of rights. It is an invitation to abuse of workers, whatever their nationality or status. That's what we do. Many other countries don't. Korea has a guest worker program where you can quit and the government will actively help you get reassigned to another employer if you're being cheated. And it works very well. It is something that we do in this country. It is completely unnecessary. The Farm Workforce Modernization Act contained a pilot program to try to do things differently. That act has not passed. So here we are, collectively unwilling to create a better alternative. This is what we've got right now. L1 visas are not going to go to these people. O1 visas are not available. Family visas are not available. The policy levers that we have revolve mostly around H2A and H2B visas. This is a guy in El Salvador holding up proudly his H2B visa. Participants in a program that I worked on. Until the U.S. immigration system is rebuilt from scratch, this is what we've got.
Could you just say what an
Yes.
H2B is?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Just because I know some
Yes.
people, well,
1952 McCarran-Walter Act was the predecessor to our 1965 Act. It had a paragraph H2 where it reversed 80 years of ban on contract labor into the United States by allowing there to be visas for short-term low-skilled labor in the United States. Our visas were named after that. They were later in 1986 split into H2A for agriculture and H2B for all non-farm employment. A lot of workers in hospitality, restaurants, forestry, groundskeeping and landscaping, seafood packing. That's H2B visas, and H2A is a lot of hand harvest and ag packing. Only in seasonal industries. Dairy industry can't get it, not seasonal, etc. Those are the visas that are the most subject to policy levers for visa access. I have sat in a New York Times panel and been told by very smart activists that migrants actually prefer unauthorized channels to H2 visas. That's how much people hate these things because of their many limitations. I was told that many migrants don't want to be tied to an employer. Working unauthorized is much better. You can quit whenever you want, go down the road, work for somebody else. That's a meme that I've heard many times. There is actually research on this subject. Simón Iscara Palacios in Tamaulipas State in Mexico got a bunch of men who had done both unauthorized work and H-2A work and sat down with them and asked them to compare and contrast. How were the experiences? This is a PhD thesis on Michoacan State, where they also got a group of indigenous people who had done both to compare and contrast the experiences. To give you the flavor of these findings, look at the title of this thesis, Mil veces contratado que de mojado. 1,000 times better to go with an H-2 visa than to go unauthorized. The pay is better, the safety is better, the reliability of next year's employment is better, the dignity is better, everything about it is better. Which is why when lawful channels are opened up, people use them because they want them, they prefer them. And denying lawful channels in the name of migrants' rights is something that has given me a lot of frustration, and I think is not consistent with the literature that we have. Here are Mexican encounters between ports of entry over several decades. Recently, the campaign that won the presidency has been talking about this crackdown, whose official name, unfortunately, was Operation Wetback, which was accompanied by a huge reduction in the number of Border Patrol encounters with Mexican nationals. They don't talk about the other arm of that policy. It was designed in concert with Operation Wetback to vastly expand the Bracero program, to increase by 150% the lawful work visas that these people had access to. Operation Wetback was a diversion of people from the black market into the formal economy. And this was not, it didn't happen by coincidence at the same time. It was designed in concert with employers, as told in histories written by Kelly Little Hernandez and Kitty Calavita. They understood that these two things needed to go together. Lawful channels supported enforcement. And that's why this was a successful effort. More recently, Catherine has studied, and maybe her co-authors are in the room too, the relationship between lawful channels and unlawful entry. In economics, Jose Bocelli and Catalina Amoedo Durantes have studied this. I have also studied this. These are vector autoregressions from a paper of mine asking when there is a diversion from past trend in the number of lawful entries, people who come to a port of entry without crossing illegally and then are admitted, does that bring so many people to the border that you get more Border Patrol apprehensions, a kind of scale effect? Or does it divert people from the desert into the ports of entry, a kind of substitution effect? And the substitution effect dominates. You see for many months after an upward tick in lawful entries, fewer people getting apprehended in the desert. Regular channels create jobs at the margin, create jobs for Americans. One of the things I was involved in was discussions of how many H-2B visas there should be and who should get them. And there were constant requests for, well, what is the effect of this on American workers? Because I hear people saying all kinds of stuff. Ethan Lewis of Dartmouth and I use an administrative quirk of the H-2B visa process, which is that the Department of Labor runs a lottery that is complex, but the bottom line is that it ends up allocating across firms that want to hire workers lawfully on H-2B non-farm visas at random. So with a lot of nuance, you can interview firms who entered the lottery, find out what happened to winners and losers, and you're getting really the pure effect, conditional on everything else, of being able to hire under this program versus not being able to hire under this program. So we asked them, what was revenue? How much did you invest in vehicles, structures, and equipment and tools? How many Americans did you hire? Here is the effect on revenue. Getting denied the opportunity to hire workers for jobs that DOL says don't require a high school degree through this program, denied the opportunity at random, causes your operations to contract by 14% across the distribution. This is not one or two firms that are outliers. This is a systematic effect across the distribution. And that scale effect overwhelms any substitution into natives. There's so much less business that fewer natives end up getting hired by firms that are randomly denied visas. This is the reverse effect. This is the effect of winning the lottery, especially in rural areas. We find higher employment of Americans, low-skill Americans, I should say Americans doing low-skill jobs, jobs that don't require a high school degree, at the same firm, caused by, at the margin, letting them or not letting them at random hire immigrants for low-skill jobs. So this is, and this does not count any off-firm effects. This doesn't count if a landscaping company is more successful and shareholders of the landscaping company buy more stuff in restaurants and that ripples through the economy. We're not capturing any of that. This is just at the same firm. Even within the walls of the same firm, expanding lawful channels creates more job opportunities for Americans. Something which is not at all part of the public consciousness, and the large majority of Americans who support both parties don't believe, is that immigration, and even unauthorized immigration, reduce the crime rate in America. Reduce it. Don't just not increase it, actually reduce it. Criminologists have written a lot about this. Sociologists have written a lot about this. Also economists. This is Ron Abramovsky at Stanford, who wrote a paper called Law-Abiding Immigrants, where they go back, these figures go back to 1940. They actually go all the way back to the late 19th century, looking for a time when immigrants had a higher incarceration rate than natives at any education level. So this is comparing natives and immigrants with a high school degree only. This is comparing natives and immigrants without a high school degree. In almost all years, at every education level, with all immigrant statuses, immigrants are less likely to be incarcerated. They're less likely to be arrested for crimes. And this was the subject of just an astonishing amount of evidence-free propaganda during the campaign. Again, just completely ignoring a very large, decades-long literature, a lot of it in economics, but most of it outside of economics on this subject. And I've talked about this issue enough to know that there are a whole lot of people who just aren't interested in statistics on this subject. They see a story in the news about a horrific event that happened to one person due to one immigrant, and they say, well, that thing wouldn't have happened if that immigrant weren't around. So if you had eliminated that immigrant, then that person would still be alive, and anybody who advocates otherwise must be in part responsible for their death. I think it's helpful for a subject that emotional to take a step back and look at some newspaper clippings from the era of Chinese exclusion in the United States. 83 years of de facto Chinese exclusion from the United States. Here are some things you could read about in the paper at that time. Police seeking Chinese killer, Chinese crime, police guard Chinese rapist, Chinese killers charging only $10 for each victim. It's a bargain. But watch out for the Chinaman rape fiend. These are a lie. It has nothing to do with whether each one of them is true. For all I know, each one of these could be reporting a true event. You really wonder, but let's suppose they're all true. The reporting on these events and not reporting on crimes committed by other people is collectively a lie, because Chinese is a category. It would be true if you talked about the name of each person. It's not true if you describe it as Chinese crime or immigrant crime or unauthorized immigrant crime. The last time this administration was in power, it created an office funded by all us US citizens to report selectively on crimes by undocumented immigrants. That's a lie, and it has nothing to do with the veracity of specific events. If people are interested in telling the truth, they would say that a specific immigrant with a specific name on a specific day did a thing. But once they describe it as immigrant crime, that's when it becomes a lie. And I'm kind of tired of hearing people say, well, is it false? I mean, look, it happened. If you're talking about it as immigrant crime, and that was embodied in the name of the publicly funded office that did this, then it is a lie. It's not true, because you're talking about exclusively about crimes committed by one category of immigrants. And once you do that, what's the limit on that? I could create a website to talk just about crimes committed by your social group. And that wouldn't make my statements true. On a brighter note, lawful channels are not unpopular in the United States. We could have different views. I don't believe that the American public in general is racist and doesn't want immigrants around, or any of the kind of memes that you see floating around the internet. The public does not like chaos. The public has not liked the regulatory situation at the border across the political spectrum. When Pew Research asked people earlier this year what would make the situation better, a lot of them said enforcement, and the majority, including substantial fraction of people leaning right, said more lawful channels for migration would help the situation at the border. That is, would complement enforcement efforts. And this is a really promising, it's not a political death sentence to espouse lawful channels. I think they're in general popular if people understand them as a package of stick and carrot, of permissiveness in order to support prohibition, rather than opening the border and anarchy and more of the same and all of that, which it's been deliberately portrayed as in political statements. The last thing I want to say, because I'm talking too long, is, and this is maybe the least appreciated in the public discourse, regular channels for migration don't just happen. Here's a political cartoon by Louis Dalrymple from the beginning of the 20th century, cowering before the waves of immigrants that include a lot of our grandparents. But let's just set that aside. And the idea is that lawful channels are like opening a door, and the whole ocean comes in, the surge, the wave, all these hydraulic metaphors. It's nothing like that. When you're actually trying to create lawful channels for migration. Lawful channels for migration are difficult. They need to be institutionally coordinated with countries of origin. There are all kinds of competing diplomatic and budget priorities. Here is national hero, in my view, Marcela Escobari, now at the National Security Council, but she was head of Western Hemisphere Affairs at USAID, going country to country, working with governments to build programs to expand access to regular work visas, in this case, El Salvador and in lots of other countries. It's much more like building a door from scratch with wood and hammer and nails. It's nothing like opening a door, because if you don't do this work, regular channels do not get going. Employers who might be interested in hiring somebody on an H-2 visa have to know about workers from that country. They have to have connections with individuals. These things have to be built. They don't just occur when somebody creates a visa. These are, with some caricature, the three policy options we have. It's incredibly clear which direction we're going in. That doesn't change what would be at the margin the most constructive policy for us, the approach for us to take. My view is that the economic evidence is clear, and other disciplines have a whole lot of to offer in this, and most of what's useful to offer in this area. And I think it could be helpful at this time to focus on what we should be for, and what is the evidence behind it as a way of maintaining personal energy and motivation and contributing to the better future of this country. We can start having the most useful conversations by understanding the root cause of the situation now. It is not the decisions of migrants. Migrants have been making decisions for centuries and millennia. It is the policy context in which these have been happening, and I do believe that we can use evidence to work for positive change in this area. So thank you so much.
The floor is open for questions.
I can figure this out by some folks online. Jim Wood at the Jason Institute for Immigration Research.
Hello, Jim.
Said that they're looking at research on registered apprenticeships for refugees and migrants as an opportunity to potentially reduce exploitation, give credentials, or maybe even be a mechanism to long-term association with the U.S. labor market. We just kind of wanted your thoughts on that process and how
Fantastic. Integration into American society and the economy, into German society and the economy, into Sweden's society and the economy is also not just something that happens in the same way and with the same outcomes. completely apart from institutional and policy context. There's a lot that we can do to shape that, and a lot of it is out of reach of immigration policymakers, no matter what direction they take immigration policy. So I think that's an incredibly constructive and helpful thing to think about.
Can I just tack on to that? I think one thing that's happened in Germany that's really interesting is people who are denied a visa, they can still continue if they're in an apprenticeship program. They get 3 years plus an additional 2 to pursue residency. But there's a model.
The private sector has worked on this. Hamdi Ulukaya at Chobani has for years had a program of hiring refugees to work at Chobani. There are all kinds of ways other than pressuring officials who may or may not be interested in listening to researchers with their papers over the years to come. I see a hand back there.
Thank you so much for doing this. I just have a quick question for you. In your presentation, I think I got a really important sense of value that we should place on migrants in general, right? And place a lot of value in in where they're coming from and also how we should react to that. So I'm curious to know, because as we go into this new administration, that value may not be seen, right? And there's a sort of polarization. Not even sort of, there is a polarization on this topic and a lot of very harsh rhetoric around this topic. I'm curious to know how you would navigate conversations with these lawmakers. As you know, the House has just been declared in the hands of the Republicans, and so that's going to also again carry on that negative rhetoric around immigration. So I'm curious to know how you would navigate those conversations and encourage policy that show value to migrants. And because I never know how to talk to people, about things that I'm so passionate about. I'm like, why don't you understand why this is important? And they're like, I don't understand. I'm like, well, why? So anyways, would love to hear your advice on that.
Thank you. I feel so unqualified or maybe anti-qualified. My track record is not such that I know how to talk to people and persuade them. I've tried to have any tiny influence that I have by being in the room with people who are already empowered to, rather than persuading the public. I do believe the public is persuadable. I don't think this nation is overwhelmed with an anti-immigrant racist fervor. And they're debating views about that. But I'm just talking about my personal view. I think a lot of people are persuadable. They have concerns. They don't like lawlessness. They don't like chaos. They don't like inflation. They don't like taxes. And there's a gigantic positive case to be made for migrants, and in all kinds of dimensions. And by going on and on about the economic ones, again, I just don't want to seem like I'm economically reductionist, but when the Congressional Budget Office says $897 billion in federal coffers due to the irregular migrants who have been arriving, set aside refugee resettlement, these are just people who have been coming inadmissible across the border. That's $3,500 additional in the pockets of every US adult. That didn't get communicated to anybody. That's a huge benefit. When Chloe East is finding that deporting 100 migrants eliminates 8.8 US jobs county by county, that means that the people who are there are creating jobs for Americans, both within establishments and across establishments. That needs to be communicated. When I hear the meme in the news that, well, immigrants are taking all the new jobs, I just choke. Let's go to the census website. We have a census representative in the room. The US Census does projections of the working age population of the US in a zero migration scenario. That's not going to start declining in 10 or 20 years. That's declining now. Today, the number of workers in the United States would be falling without immigration. So yes, not only are 100% of new jobs going to immigrants, more than 100% of new jobs are going to immigrants. In that, we would have fewer and fewer workers without immigrants. Those are the people driving the US economy. Those are the people raising the return to innovation. Those are the people raising the return to entrepreneurship by increasing the scope and the specialization of the US economy. And that's a wonderful thing. But whenever I talk about these things, I think people rightly accuse me of instrumentalizing immigrants, and they're not for GDP, and that's all 100% true. And I think economists like me have been spectacularly ineffective at finding ways to communicate the positive aspects of immigrants participation in the economy, to set aside all of the other aspects of their presence. And I really think there's a lot more to be done there, and that would be effective. I don't have good evidence of that, and maybe it won't be. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's my ill-informed argument.
And just to follow up, is that okay?
It's because I'm talking too long. It's not.
But maybe Sophie?
I just had a quick clarification question, because you mentioned briefly the potential harm of tying a migrant to their employer via an H-2 visa.
Yes.
But then you mentioned among those studies, I think it was with the indigenous group, they mentioned that they actually preferred the H-2 visa, or did I hear that incorrectly?
Yes. So
Okay.
there's a third study from Guatemala of interviews of focus groups of people who have done both. They can't find one person who said, yeah, it's kind of better to be unauthorized. So with all of its warts and all, and I don't need to minimize those problems, expanding at the margin access to those visas is something that migrants would prefer.
Right.
Of course, they would much greater prefer a vastly better guest work program. And I have tried to work on that very ineffectively too. But if we're talking about the short term of people who are arriving at the border now and need some kind of access on terms that are as mutually beneficial as they possibly can be, that's what we have to work with. But I can't tell you how many meetings I was in the US government where somebody said, this is a terrible program, and we're not going to expand access to it until it's fundamentally reformed.
Right.
People were telling me that on days last December when 10,000 people arrived at the border that day. 10,000 people. And it's just not serious to say, like, well, give us some more time to reform our immigration laws. We've been waiting 34 years since the last reform, but someday we'll get to it. We got to work with what we have. And I don't mean to minimize anybody's very legitimate concerns about a highly problematic set of visas.
So then just one, sorry guys. If you had any visa in particular to expand, would you say, I don't know if you've done studies on this, like a humanitarian visa would be more beneficial, or expanding access to those work visas?
You mean existing visa?
Yeah.
Or
I guess just if you were in the government right now and you could do whatever you wanted, like what visa? I know, but like if you just had to put emphasis on one visa in particular, like would it be temporary work visas, or I guess, like, have you done any studies or research on what might benefit us all the most?
if we're talking about, if we're carefully balancing the policy triad that I teach my students, welfare maximizing and politically supportable and administratively feasible, which is nowhere near the best. The closest thing I ever saw to actually becoming law is the W visa in the 2007 and 2008 kind of came close immigration reform, passed the Senate. It didn't do badly, but there it was, 200,000 W visas a year, and those would have opened up 3-year, not seasonal, but 3-year long access to a wide range of jobs that would include the whole dairy industry, that would include elder care, that would include all kinds of sectors that don't currently have access to pretty much any visa. And it was going to be renewable. And it didn't have a clear path to citizenship. It was not explicitly a provisional visa, but it was just drastically better than the visa we have, particularly because it had no employer tying. It was just a W visa to work in there was some question whether it would be geographically or industry limited, but it was definitely not employer tied. And that was not crazy. John McCain almost made it happen. And we can imagine much better versions than that, but that is something that would immediately complement enforcement efforts. It would give people a real option for some sort of near-term stability and dignity and earning power, and notwithstanding the many legitimate concerns that people have about guest work visas, my view is that expanding that would be way better than nothing, and that we. By insisting on the best, often we get nowhere, which is what has been happening for 34 years. I'm 52. For most of my life, people have been waiting for some kind of immigration reform. We can't wait for that.
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about the 3 options, and I totally agree with you about regular pathways being the solution. And I'm thinking that one struggle with that is the fact that to sell it to public opinion, one needs to have a tougher attitude regarding the border. This is what you said.
Yes.
And I think there has been, it's been challenging for the left to accept that, to come to terms with the fact that we need to be tougher at the border, because it also means rejecting people who have, according to the Convention on the Rights of Refugees, the right to ask for asylum.
Yes.
So I think there is a very big problem also, because as you said, for example, one needs to pair these two pathways, legal pathway and border enforcement. But I think myself, I feel a little bit, I feel uncomfortable with being really tough on the border. But I think that's what is needed to sell legal and increase in legal pathways. And I guess that's what the Democratic administration came to terms with, because at the end, what Biden did was to completely close the border. And
I mean, not completely closed.
well, but with a
Certainly restricted,
really-
for sure.
Yes,
Yeah.
the numbers. But I wonder about all of us who are in the left, how willing are we to go? Because I see it also in Italy, there is not this appetite to go all the way. And I think it's a conversation that we need to have among us who think in a positive way about migration, who want to. Then there are the people to whom we cannot sell legal pathways because they just don't want any migrants at all.
Yeah.
But I see that as a big political challenge.
Absolutely. I mean, if I could quickly show a picture. This is Ruth Wassam put together data from different years on the stock of unauthorized migrants in the US. So here is 1986, the eve of a regularization of 3 million, which is almost 3 million. 4 years later, there were more. Why? Was it because something about the regularization encouraged more people to come? That's not what Arrhenius and Zavani find. They find the evidence inconsistent with encouragement. It was that the 1986 reform was all about we'll have a big amnesty, quote unquote, for people who are already here. We're going to criminalize crossings of the border and employment of unauthorized immigrants and crack down. And after those things work, then we might in the future think about lawful channels. 1986 did not create meaningful lawful channels. And that is the reason why 4 years later, there were more net of 3 million regularizations. And then after that, it skyrocketed to 12 million. And right now we're over 12 million after years of decline. It was this mentality that the only time we can discuss lawful channels is after absolute enforcement. And that is another way of saying that lawful channels will never come. We've been on this hamster wheel since I was in high school. And it's maybe communicating this impossibility could help this historical experience, which I think is not well known. At the same time, the idea that somehow we are going to divert 10,000 arrivals per day into lawful channels is definitely not politically supportable and maybe not even administratively feasible. And there has to be a compromise on this. So I don't see any alternative. Winston Churchill said the United States always does the right thing after trying all of the alternatives. We've tried the alternatives for decades on this one, and they haven't worked. And I think that that maybe if thoughtful observers of public events, including academics, were more explicit about the need for this kind of compromise and offering information about successful episodes of that compromise. I offered one with quote unquote Operation Wetback, which was explicitly a bundled combination of enforcement and lawful channels, and serious enforcement and serious expansion of lawful channels that unquestionably worked. Unquestionably addressed concerns that people had about chaos at the border at that time, which for that time was extensive. Instead, we just get memes about, well, Operation Wetback crackdown and everything was fine, so we're going to do it again. That's what people heard from the current presidential campaign. I don't think people know what happened in Operation Wetback, which was nothing like that. So we could help maybe make the case for the compromise. But I think even seasoned advocates just don't know a lot about that history. That's not a great answer, but that's my answer. Excuse me.
Let me combine two from online. The first one from Lucas Villery out of the Rio Grande Valley is asking if you could speak about if there's any connection between immigration and housing affordability at all in the research. And then Sandeep from the Immigration Research Center or Institute for Immigration Research asks about the role of administrative requirement costs on the H2 system, and if you see that as like impacting that at all.
Economists are pointy-headed people who often miss the point. But one thing that we think a lot about is the word cause. What caused one thing or didn't cause another thing? And when people say, "Oh, immigration causes housing prices to rise," that is not a dispassionate way of approaching the data, letting the data speak. That is a value-laden statement, because when you talk about a cause, economists think of, well, all else equal, if there were less immigration, would there be lower housing prices? Sure. All else equal is a value judgment. It means that the other forces, which are, for example, drastically constraining the supply of housing, and particularly affordable housing in many of the immigrant destinations in America, are held constant. So deciding that we're going to focus on one factor that varies and not discuss the variation in another factor is not a value-free statement. So even the statement of immigration causes housing prices embodies a bunch of assumptions that I'm not willing to make. There are lots of other there are many other things about the public discourse that I don't understand there. 3/4 of Americans own their home. Roughly 50% of Americans with a high school degree or less own their home. So if anybody thinks that it's universally, generally, unquestionably a good idea for housing to be cheaper, we're talking about reducing the value of the main asset of most of the population, including the less educated part of the population. So that has complex distributional consequences. That doesn't mean it's a bad idea to make housing more affordable, but it's something that I wish were more nuanced in the discussion. The distributional consequences of increasing or reducing housing prices are large for large parts of the population, and there are many winners and losers from that. But separately from that, it is a value-laden statement to say, well, immigration is natural, but restrictions on housing supply are not, or restrictions on housing supply are unquestionable and immigration is not natural. We take a position when we say, look, this study showed that all else equal, immigrants raise housing prices. And economists are really not good at identifying the many assumptions, normative assumptions that go into a statement like that. You can publish a paper saying, look, I have determined that immigrants raise housing prices because of my causal identification strategy, without any referee saying what is the basis of assuming that all other factors are held constant here? Oh, because I'm studying the effect of immigration. Well, in studying the effect of immigration and drawing any sort of policy conclusion from that, we are taking a normative stance on the other policies that affect housing prices. And that's something you just don't get from almost all economic studies. And there are many economic studies showing that all else equal, domestic and international immigrants moving into cities, including by my former classmate Albert Saiz, raise housing prices. But the policy implications of that are nil unless we're willing to discuss the relative weight of different policies that would shape immigration versus alternative policies that would also make that the supply of affordable housing greater. A normative judgment about which a finding like that is not informative. That makes any sense. Wait, and I can't remember the second question. I'm sorry.
It's just, do you think that the administrative, with regards to H2, those H2 visas, do you think the administrative requirements are too costly for employers? Is there something we have to implement? Like, how does the employer side factor in?
They hate it. You can't find, it's very difficult to find an employer who loves the H2 visa program. Farmers often have to build housing on or near their farm, which has all kinds of requirements to be up to code. It's quite expensive for people to get involved in the program. They have to submit to wage and hour inspections all of the time. They could have their access to their workforce ruled out by DOL coming in 1 year and saying, well, last year we agreed that you couldn't find Americans, but this year we think that you can find Americans, so you're not going to be able to hire any of those people you've worked with for the last 8 years. You're just going to have to. They hate it. They go on for hours about how much they hate it, and it is not designed to serve the needs of employers. It's designed that the whole regulatory apparatus is designed with reason to protect migrant workers and by extension American workers, which is the right thing to do. But it is a large burden that has to be borne by employers. And when we were trying to get employers interested in non-Mexican migrants under those programs, Mexicans are 94% of ag visas and 75% of non-ag visas in our low skill work program. Trying to extend that access to Honduras, to Nicaraguans, to Colombians. It was incredibly difficult because they already felt so burdened by the program that paying even $100 or $200 more for a plane ticket instead of a bus ticket was seen as the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm already kind of at the edge with this thing. Why would I collaborate with you? Was a reasonable reaction from reasonable people that we often got. There are other countries that do it way better. If I had to pick one example of a country that does temporary work visas vastly better, it's Korea. Korea has, at last count, over 17 bilateral agreements with Bangladesh and Philippines and Laos and lots of other countries to allow people to come in for 3-year temporary work visas, renewable. They have worker mobility between employers, as I pointed out. They have extensive pre-departure training. They've had language training pre-departure, which collectively help secure their rights much better than many other guest worker programs. And a person interested in greater rights for migrants in those programs, I wish there were more weight put on advocacy for reforming them and improving them rather than restricting access to them. And so many times we encounter people with the ability to extend visa access who considered them to be so problematic that they didn't want there to be one additional visa. And I don't mean to criticize them. I don't mean to say that their concerns aren't legitimate, but my case is that they're overweighting those concerns relative to what happens to people who don't have lawful channels. And we're about to find out what that is for millions of people, which I think is a great tragedy relative to what it could have been. I go on and on about every question. So.
Why don't we have just one more? And Raymond, I saw his hand, so
Sure.
and then, yeah.
See, a lot of, not only here in the US, but a lot of governments in Europe and other places, the existing government, they were toppled down from the different elections that they hold.
Yes.
And one of the arguments is the migrants, there's too many migrants, even in Europe. Countries in Europe are saying, we voted because there's too many migrants. And here in the US, one of the arguments is that there's too many migrants and the economy is the inflation. But we've seen in your presentation that the migrants, they contribute a lot in the economy. And I've seen some arguments that it's the inflation, it's after COVID, because they've never seen, there's too many governments, that's existing governments have been toppled down from elections. They've never seen this in decades. So I guess, could you talk a little bit more from an economic perspective, whether the argument that's being used that the migrants are the cause for the economic downturn, when in fact it could also be because of the COVID and the inflation?
Definitely. I mentioned the work of Warwick McKibben, which is to my knowledge the best that is out there on this subject. He's not an immigration advocate whatsoever. He is an international macro modeler who's usually modeling the effects of trade agreements and that sort of thing. He was asked by the Peterson Institute for International Economics to study, well, what happens to things like inflation when you forcibly remove 3 million workers, say, from the US economy. And this is it's going to be a huge supply shock. It is going to be an interruption of the ability of US firms to provide goods and services that outweigh the negative effect on aggregate demand from removing those people from the pool of consumers in the US, put it in purely economic material terms. That means that their presence relative to that alternative scenario reduces inflation. And I just it's been bizarre to see, you know, this incoming administration. There was Stephen Miller at the White House podium in August 2017 advocating for the RAISE Act, a bill that never passed Congress, but it would have reduced green cards to the US, lawful immigration to the US by 43%. You can see from the name of the act, the RAISE Act, that the whole point was creating job opportunities for Americans. At the time he was doing it, unemployment was 4%. And then COVID came along and unemployment shot up to 14%. And they barred new arrival green cards, which was roughly half of the green cards, and on exclusively economic grounds. The executive orders that did that don't mention COVID or public health or anything. It was exclusively because, well, we need more job opportunities for Americans. You know, when you're prescribing lemon juice for a headache and for cancer, there's a problem with your medical reasoning when you're prescribing the same exact immigration policy of let's cut legal immigration by half, when there are historically high opportunities for immigrants and natives to collaborate with each other in generating jobs for each other, in specializing in different things and building the US economy, 2017, versus when the economy is temporarily falling apart and lots of people have no job opportunities. When your policy prescription in those two situations is exactly the same thing, which is let's cut lawful immigration by half, it's bizarre to me that anybody still believes them. So now they're saying that deporting millions of people in the face of Chloe East et al.'s evidence and a lot of other evidence that I didn't show, is finding exactly the opposite. It's just bizarre. You know, I'm 52. Unemployment over the last year on average has never been lower in my lifetime. That's historically high opportunities for people to work together in producing goods and services. And that means increasing real income for everybody. As you say, there is no good evidence that the wave of inflation that we had after COVID was due to immigration. Immigration was way down at the time that prices were going up. And the credible evidence that we have suggests that the supply shock that is coming from this indiscriminate, numb to evidence policy it is going to raise inflation even more. But of course, for the voting public, they'll always be able to attribute it to something else. And there's never going to be any sort of accountability for anybody in these realms. It's left to people who are interested in evidence and interested in careful reasoning to just decide strategically what their direction is going to be. And I think you can see an abiding faith in me, in spite of everything, and maybe wrongly, that there continues to be a role for simply explaining to policymakers and the public some of this evidence. I think it has value. I think a lot of people are persuadable. I think Americans in general are pragmatic about stuff. And I think it's possible that some of the drastic negative economic consequences of the high deportation scenarios, if they come to pass, could contribute to greater scrutiny of those things from an economic perspective. I expect and hope that they'll be scrutinized from many other legal and humanitarian and other perspectives. But the economic effects that are predicted by the leading researchers are large, and I think that they might even be enough signal to show up among the noise.
Okay. And we have to end. So please help me thank Michael.
Thank you.
So much.